James, good morning to you. Foreign policy-wise, how best can this situation be de-escalated, or has it gone well beyond that point now?
I'm afraid you're right. There's no chance that the negotiations, which are due to restart again today, are going to be the way out of this, because the same is true now as it was, frankly, 6 months or even 6 years ago. But the two sides have irreconcilable differences. The reality is that Ukraine wants to be a sovereign, independent state, and Russia demands control over that state. Those two things, you can't square that circle. So I'm afraid to say that we're going to be in this, what is the largest ground invasion of a country since 1939 to 45 for quite some time to come. And to be honest with you, we're still at the very beginning of this war. I'm sorry not to put a better gloss on it than that.
UN General Assembly yesterday voting overwhelmingly to deplore this invasion. Really quite meaningless?
I think that it is important that we show that Russia has no friends. I mean, apart from Belarus, if you like, and the occasional African country such as Eritrea. But for the most part, the reality is that whilst Russia had some allies, even prior to this invasion, then nobody can possibly support Russia for what it would mean for their own sovereignty. They see the ramifications. They see where this could go globally. And so I think that the UN, though toothless in many ways, though unable to actually prevent a war, it does have the power of showing how isolated that Russia is. And that is important because every bit of pressure on Moscow can help.
Where does this end for Putin?
The end game is a tricky one here. And I think for Putin, personally, he is in a must-win situation. No Russian leader loses a war and survives it. The problem is, of course, and you're well aware of this from the news of the last few days, is that he's painted himself into a corner, but holding a nuclear button. And so obviously we have to worry that if he loses, if he sees himself as losing, then he resorts to the most desperate of measures. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the way this is going to work out, but the reality is that Putin must win this militarily to have any chance of political survival, and that's what Putin's all about, as well as the accumulation of wealth and the gathering of Russian lands, which we're seeing now. But I think that the problem is that both sides must win. If the West doesn't win, then the West is finished in a certain way as well. The rules-based international order, as we understand it, the Westphalian order, whatever you want to call it, that's finished too. Article 5 comes under threat, even though Ukraine isn't a part of it. So if both sides must win, and yet at the same time it's impossible for them to lose because it would mean they're toast in some ways, then I think, again, you're in this very sticky situation where you're relying on negotiations which, as I say, can't work because of irreconcilable differences, which means you've got to slog it out and hope that it's a conventional ground warfare. And let's be perfectly honest here, although we know that Ukraine has mounted incredibly impressive resistance, then the Russian forces are still numerically vastly superior, and they can take Ukraine eventually, by, albeit very bloodily. And so we're looking at the very question of the survival of Ukraine.
James, in your position there at Chatham House, can you envisage a Russia without Putin? What would it look like? Would it be much different?
That's really interesting, and we've been asking ourselves this for almost 22 years. That's how long he's been in power. And of course, no one lasts forever, but most general secretaries of the Soviet Union were carried out in coffins by and large. They didn't retire, or a couple were deposed, such as Khrushchev. But the reality is that there's not really a succession mechanism in a dictatorship such as Russia. He's 69 this year. He's 69 now. He's 70 this year. And he must be thinking about his legacy. And the result, and that's probably at least part of a reason which has pushed him to do this right now. As for what comes next, I think it would be very unsafe to assume that what comes after Putin is better than Putin. The least likely option for Russia, I'm very sorry to say, is that post-Putin we see some kind of nice, cozy liberal democracy. So I'm afraid that much as it would be preferable, and we shouldn't be fearful of what comes after Putin, and so we must keep him in place for fear of what comes next. Then at the same time, those lined up in succession to come afterwards, and there's a pool or a squad of 7 or 8 of them who are possibles, are no more friendly, no more pro-Western, and just as nationalistic as Vladimir Putin himself, I'm sorry to say.
Because, of course, Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic, Alexei Navalny, has been jailed. And I just wonder, are you worried for him? I mean, yesterday from jail, he was getting messages out saying that Putin was a clearly insane little Tsar, that a price must be paid, people should not fear being jailed, that people must fight for peace. Do you think that that's going to cost him?
Alexei Navalny's life has been under threat for probably about 10 years now, and indeed he has almost been killed, as you know, with a Novichok poisoning in the far east of Russia just a couple of years ago. It is, frankly, every day there's a possibility that he would undergo an accident, in quotes, in prison. And it does seem to me that the more that he embarrasses the government, and he's still able to from behind bars, which is incredible, but he's a very brave man. I mean, he's a person who voluntarily went back to Russia in the full knowledge that he would be incarcerated for, pretty much ad infinitum. So I think, but the problem is, at the same time, is the rest of Russia's opposition. There are some very brave people in Russia. I mean, the Liberal Party head, Grigory Yavlinsky, the former Prime Minister, even Mikhail Kasyanov. I mean, they are outspoken, vocal critics, but they are completely impotent. They have no airtime, and I'm afraid there's no chance of them succeeding Vladimir Putin.
James Nixey, thank you so much for your take on things. James is director of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House.